332 BC. The dust clouds rising from the Macedonian army stretched 15 miles across the Mesopotamian plain, visible from the walls of Babylon days before Alexander's forces arrived. King Darius III of Persia, commanding the largest empire the world had ever seen, stood atop those walls watching the approaching storm with growing dread. He had faced these men before at Issus, where his army of 100,000 had been shattered by a force 1/5 its size. Now, with Babylon's gates opening in surrender without a single blow struck, Darius understood a terrible truth. Alexander hadn't just conquered an empire. He had made conquest itself obsolete by creating a military formation so devastatingly effective that resistance became futile. The Macedonian Phalanx wasn't simply a better army, it was a revolutionary system that transformed warfare from chaotic melees into choreographed annihilation. At its core stood the sarissa, an 18-foot pike that turned ordinary farmers into an unstoppable wall of bronze-tipped death. What made this weapon extraordinary wasn't its length, though that was unprecedented. It was how it mathematically redefined the geometry of battle. A single phalanx soldier, holding his sarissa at the optimal 45-degree angle, projected 5 rows of pike points forward. The man behind him added his pike to the formation, then the man behind him. By the 6th row, the front of the phalanx bristled with 30 spear points per square yard, creating a zone of death that no cavalry charge, no infantry formation, no warrior's courage could penetrate. Ancient historians described it as a forest of iron that moved with the precision of a single organism. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. Traditional infantry formations like the Greek hoplite phalanx relied on 8-foot spears and individual combat skill. When 2 such formations met, the first 3 rows engaged in direct combat, shields clashing, spears thrusting, men dying in confused melees that could last hours. The deeper rows existed mainly for weight, pushing the front ranks forward through sheer mass. Victory depended on which side's front-rank warriors were braver, stronger, more skilled. But against the Macedonian phalanx, none of that mattered. The 18-foot sarissa meant Alexander's men could kill you while standing 13 feet beyond your weapon's reach. You could be the greatest warrior in history, wielding the finest bronze sword ever forged, wearing armour that had turned aside 100 blows. It made no difference. You would die before you got close enough to fight back. The first army to discover this reality was the Illyrian Tribal Confederation in 335 BC. The Illyrians were mountain warriors, fierce fighters who had resisted Greek expansion for generations. Their king, Clytus, commanded 15,000 of the toughest infantry in the Balkans, men who had been training for warfare since childhood, who considered death in battle the highest honour. When Alexander's army of 12,000 appeared in the mountain passes near Pelion, Clytus was confident. The Illyrians held the high ground. They had fortified positions. They outnumbered the Macedonians in this particular engagement. They were fighting on their own territory, defending their homeland. Every advantage belonged to them except one. They had never faced the phalanx. What happened next was recorded by Arrian, the Roman historian who chronicled Alexander's campaigns based on first-hand accounts from Macedonian veterans. The description reads like a technical manual for systematic slaughter. Alexander's phalanx advanced uphill in perfect formation, 120 men wide and 16 ranks deep. The front 6 ranks lowered their sarissas to attack position. The rear 10 ranks held theirs vertically, creating a canopy that deflected arrows and javelins. The Illyrians charged downhill with all the fury of men defending their freedom. They crashed into the phalanx at full speed, shields raised, weapons ready, war cries echoing off the mountains. They died without landing a single blow. The sarissa points struck them in the face, throat, and chest, while they were still 3 steps away from the Macedonian line. The lucky ones died instantly, bronze pike points punching through flesh and bone with the accumulated force of the entire formation behind them. The unlucky ones were caught on the pikes, trapped like fish on spears, unable to advance or retreat, screaming as the phalanx continued its inexorable march forward, trampling them beneath bronze-shod boots. In 40 minutes, 3,000 Illyrians lay dead. The Macedonians lost 17 men. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The genius of Alexander's system went far beyond the sarissa's reach. The phalanx operated on a principle that wouldn't be fully articulated until the Industrial Revolution, but which Alexander's father, Philip II, had understood instinctively. The division of labour creates efficiency that individual skill cannot match. Each soldier in the phalanx had a specific role, trained to perfection through endless drilling. The front-rank men were the steadiest veterans, men who could hold formation under cavalry charges and arrow storms. Their job was simple: keep the sarissa level, maintain spacing, step forward when ordered. They didn't need to be great warriors. They needed to be reliable components in a machine. The 2nd through 6th ranks added their pikes to the killing zone, creating the overlapping layers of death that made the formation impenetrable. The 7th through 10th ranks held their sarissas vertically, protecting the formation from projectiles while adding weight to the forward push. The 11th through 16th ranks carried their pikes on their shoulders, ready to replace fallen comrades or extend the sarissa forest forward as front ranks tired. Each soldier wore 40 pounds of armour, bronze cuirass protecting the torso, bronze greaves on the shins, bronze helmet with cheek guards. The left arm bore the small pelter shield, just 2 feet in diameter, strapped to the forearm. This was crucial. Traditional hoplite shields were 3 feet across and held by a grip requiring one hand. The smaller pelter freed both hands to wield the massive sarissa while still providing protection. But the brilliance of the system revealed itself in training. Philip II, Alexander's father, and the true architect of Macedonian military supremacy, had spent 20 years perfecting the phalanx through methods that seemed insane to contemporary Greeks. He drilled his soldiers 8 hours a day, 6 days a week, for months before they ever saw combat. They practiced formation marching until they could maintain perfect lines while climbing mountains, fording rivers, or advancing at a run. They practiced the syntagma, the basic unit of 16 by 16 men, until every soldier knew his position by heart and could reform the square from any scattered position in under a minute. They practiced the pike drill until lowering and raising the 18-foot sarissa became as natural as breathing, until they could do it in perfect unison with their entire unit without a single verbal command. Ancient observers mocked this training as un-Greek. Real warriors, the Athenians and Spartans argued, relied on individual prowess and courage. This Macedonian system reduced noble soldiers to mindless automatons executing drill patterns. They were right about the system and completely wrong about its implications. The Macedonians weren't training warriors. They were training something far more dangerous, a programmable weapons platform that turned human beings into the components of a killing machine. An Athenian hoplite might be a better individual fighter than any Macedonian. Put him in a duel, he might win 9 times out of 10. But duels don't win wars, systems do. The phalanx's first true test against a major power came at Chaeronea in 338 BC, 2 years before Alexander's reign began. Philip II faced a combined army of Thebes and Athens, the 2 greatest military powers in Greece, fielding 35,000 men against his 32,000. The stakes were absolute. If Philip lost, Macedonian power would be broken forever. If he won, all of Greece would fall under his control. The battle began at dawn on August 2nd with the traditional hoplite clash, shield walls meeting with the crash of bronze on bronze, spears thrusting, men shouting and dying. For 3 hours the lines held. Traditional Greek warfare at its finest, brave men fighting in close formation, neither side gaining advantage. Then Alexander, commanding the Companion Cavalry on the right flank at age 18, noticed something. The Theban left wing had advanced slightly, pursuing a feigned Macedonian retreat. This created a small gap in the Greek line, perhaps 50 yards wide, barely noticeable in the chaos of battle. Alexander didn't need orders. He wheeled his cavalry through the gap while his phalanx units pivoted 45 degrees and struck the Theban flank. What followed demonstrated the phalanx's true horror. The Thebans, among the finest heavy infantry in the world, suddenly found themselves facing sarissas from an unexpected angle. Their shields, designed to protect their front, left their right sides exposed. The Macedonian pikes struck from the side where armour was thinnest, where formation discipline offered no protection. The sacred band of Thebes, 300 elite warriors who had never retreated from any battle in 40 years, died to the last man. They stood their ground and were systematically impaled, unable to flee because of their oath, unable to fight back because the sarissas struck from beyond their reach. When the battle ended, Philip walked the field and wept at the sight of the sacred band lying in perfect formation, each man dead where he had stood, each body pierced by multiple pike wounds. It was the death of the old way of warfare, and Philip understood it completely. The Phalanx's weakness was as obvious as its strength. The formation was inflexible, difficult to turn, vulnerable on the flanks and rear, nearly useless on rough terrain. The 18-foot sarissa required both hands and perfect balance, meaning Phalanx soldiers couldn't easily defend themselves if the formation broke. A single man with a sarissa was almost helpless against a single swordsman. The entire system depended on maintaining formation. Break the formation, and you transformed unstoppable warriors into victims. Every military theorist in the ancient world understood this. The Persians, the Indians, the countless tribal confederations that faced Alexander knew the Phalanx had weaknesses. They all planned to exploit those weaknesses. They all died trying. The problem was that Alexander never deployed the Phalanx alone. He had created a combined arms system where each component protected the other's weaknesses while exploiting their strengths. The Phalanx formed the anvil, an immovable block of bronze and wood that fixed enemy formations in place. The Companion Cavalry, Alexander's elite horsemen, formed the hammer, smashing into enemy flanks and rear once the Phalanx had locked them in place. Light infantry, hyperspists armed with shorter spears and larger shields, protected the Phalanx's vulnerable flanks. Archers and javelin throwers weakened enemy formations before contact. Siege engineers travelled with the army, ready to reduce any fortification. But the genius of the system lay in how these components worked together, like an organism's organs supporting each other. The Battle of Granicus in 334 BC demonstrated this integration perfectly. Alexander's first major engagement after crossing into Asia, Granicus pitted 35,000 Macedonians against 40,000 Persians and Greek mercenaries defending the eastern bank of a river. The Persians held every advantage. They had chosen the battlefield, positioning themselves on higher ground behind a river with steep banks. They had more cavalry, 20,000 against Alexander's 5,000. They had hired 20,000 Greek mercenary, hoplites, men who understood Western warfare and could match the Phalanx in close combat. Their commander, Memnon of Rhodes, was arguably the finest military mind in Persian service. His strategy was sound: hold the river crossing, use cavalry to prevent any Macedonian crossing attempt, wear down Alexander's forces with arrows and javelins, then counterattack once the Macedonians were exhausted and disorganized. It should have worked. Alexander didn't let it. He personally led his Companion Cavalry into the river at the strongest point of Persian defense, directly into the teeth of their cavalry concentration. It was tactically insane, militarily indefensible, and psychologically perfect. The Persians, seeing Alexander's distinctive white-plumed helmet and the royal squadron around him, redirected their entire cavalry force to kill the Macedonian king. They nearly succeeded. Alexander was unhorsed, his helmet shattered by a Persian sword. A Persian noble, named Spithridates, raised his sword for the killing blow. Clytus, Alexander's bodyguard, cut off Spithridates' arm at the shoulder, saving the king's life. But while the entire Persian cavalry was focused on Alexander's squadron, the Macedonian phalanx crossed the river uncontested. They came out of the water in perfect formation, sarissas level, advancing uphill against the Greek mercenaries. The mercenaries, veterans of 100 battles, recognized what was happening and tried to retreat. The Persian cavalry, still engaged with Alexander's horsemen, couldn't support them. The phalanx caught them in the open, on flat ground, exactly where the formation was most effective. Arrian's account describes the slaughter in clinical detail. The phalanx advanced at a walk, covering 100 yards in 3 minutes, maintaining perfect spacing and alignment. The Greek mercenaries, realizing retreat was impossible, formed their own phalanx, 8-foot spears against 18-foot sarissas. It wasn't a battle, it was a demonstration of physics. The longer weapons struck first, always. Every exchange resulted in dead mercenaries and untouched Macedonians. In 20 minutes, 18,000 Greek mercenaries died. The Macedonians offered no quarter, treating them as traitors for serving Persia. Alexander lost 300 men total, most of them cavalry in the initial river crossing. The victory at Granicus opened all of Asia Minor to Alexander, but more importantly it sent a message that spread throughout the Persian Empire. The Macedonian phalanx was unbeatable in open battle. Darius III, the great king of Persia, understood this after Granicus but believed he had the solution. He would use terrain to nullify the phalanx's advantage. He chose Issus, a coastal plain where mountains on one side and sea on the other created a battlefield only 2 miles wide. This narrow frontage would prevent Alexander from using his superior tactics, from executing flanking maneuvers, from bringing his cavalry to bear effectively. The Persian army would simply overlap the Macedonian line, surrounding them through sheer numbers. Darius assembled 100,000 men. He positioned 30,000 Greek mercenaries in the centre, matching phalanx against phalanx. He placed 60,000 Persian infantry on the wings, armed with spears, axes and wicker shields. He kept 10,000 elite Persian cavalry in reserve. The numbers were overwhelming. The terrain was perfect. The strategy was sound. Darius was certain of victory. He was certain right up until the moment Alexander's phalanx hit his Greek mercenaries and destroyed them in 15 minutes. What happened at Issus rewrote military theory. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia formed their phalanx and advanced to meet the Macedonians. They were professional soldiers, well-trained, well-equipped, using the same basic formation and weapons as their opponents. On paper, this should have been a grinding match of endurance. But Alexander's phalanx had something the mercenaries lacked: 16 ranks of depth against their 8 ranks. When the formations met, the first 6 ranks of each side engaged, sarissa against sarissa. For approximately 30 seconds the lines held. Then the pressure from the Macedonian rear ranks began to tell. The 10th rank of Macedonians was pushing the 9th rank, which pushed the 8th, which pushed the 7th, all the way down to the front rank. The accumulated weight of 16 men deep created irresistible forward momentum. The mercenaries, only 8 ranks deep, couldn't generate equivalent pressure. They were physically shoved backward. As the mercenary line gave ground, gaps opened in their formation. Sarissa points found those gaps, striking men from angles they couldn't defend against. Once the first mercenary fell, the integrity of his unit collapsed. The man who had been behind him suddenly faced the phalanx front without the protection of his comrade's shield. He died. The man behind him died. The formation unravelled like a pulled thread, and once a phalanx formation breaks, everyone dies. The mercenaries routed. Darius, watching from his command chariot, saw his centre collapse and panicked. He fled the battlefield at full speed, abandoning his army, his family and his dignity. His 60,000 infantry on the wings, seeing their king flee, broke and ran. The battle became a massacre. The Macedonians pursued for miles, killing fleeing Persians by the thousands. Estimates suggest 50,000 Persians died at Issus. Alexander lost fewer than 500 men. But the most revealing detail came from captured Persian officers, interrogated after the battle. When asked why they had fled, one officer explained something that military historians would debate for centuries. We could not understand how they kept formation while moving forward. Our men would attack, die, and the line never wavered. No gap appeared, no weakness showed. It was like fighting a wall that bled you, but could not be bled itself. We have fought Greeks before. When you kill the front rank, you see hesitation in the second rank, fear in the third. But these Macedonians, when the front rank fell, the second rank stepped forward instantly. There was no pause, no hesitation, no humanity, just the machine continuing its function. This was the essence of what made the Macedonian phalanx revolutionary. It removed the human element from warfare, the fear, the hesitation, the self-preservation instinct that makes soldiers falter. Through endless drilling, Philip and Alexander had created soldiers whose response to death was automatic advance, whose reaction to casualties was perfect formation maintenance, whose training overrode every survival instinct. Modern military psychologists call this state of training drill beyond conscious thought. The Prussians would rediscover it in the 18th century. The modern military still uses it, but Alexander had perfected it 2,000 years earlier. After Issus, Darius tried diplomacy. He offered Alexander everything west of the Euphrates River, 10,000 talents of gold and his daughter's hand in marriage. Parmenion, Alexander's senior general, counselled acceptance. "If I were Alexander," Parmenion said, "I would accept these terms." Alexander's response became one of history's most famous retorts. "I would too, if I were Parmenion." The campaign continued. For the next year, Alexander systematically reduced every Persian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean. Tyre, considered impregnable on its island fortress, fell after a 7-month siege where Alexander built a causeway to the island and deployed siege towers taller than the city walls. Gaza, defended by eunuch commander Battis and considered unbreachable, fell after 2 months when Alexander's engineers undermined the walls. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator, crowning him pharaoh. Every victory reinforced the same lesson. Resistance was futile. The Phalanx would come. The Phalanx was inevitable. Darius spent that year assembling the largest army in human history. He called warriors from every corner of his empire: Bactrians from the east, Indians from beyond the Indus, Scythians from the northern steppes, and the entire levy of the Persian heartland. Ancient sources claim he gathered 250,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry. Modern historians dispute these numbers as exaggerations, suggesting perhaps 100,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry. It doesn't matter. Either number represented overwhelming numerical superiority. Darius also changed his strategy. No more narrow battlefields that prevented him from using his numbers. He chose the plains near Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, a vast flat expanse where he could deploy his entire force and overlap Alexander's flanks by miles. He spent months preparing the battlefield, levelling the ground to perfection for his scythed chariots, war machines with blades attached to their wheels designed to tear through infantry formations. October 1st, 331 BC. Alexander's army of 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry faced Darius's, host across 2 miles of prepared ground. The Persian line extended so far that its flanks were invisible in the morning dust. Alexander's entire army could have fit in Darius's centre with room to spare. The Persians had numerical superiority, terrain advantage, and the element of choosing when to fight. Every factor favoured them except one. Alexander had the Phalanx. The battle opened with Darius launching his scythed chariots, 200 war machines thundering toward the Macedonian line. They should have torn through the Phalanx like paper, the blades catching on sarissas, pulling men from formation, creating chaos. The Macedonians responded with a tactic they had drilled specifically for this threat. As the chariots approached, the Phalanx ranks opened, creating lanes through the formation. The chariots thundered through the gaps, harming nobody. Light infantry on the flanks pelted them with javelins, killing horses and drivers. Within minutes, all 200 chariots were destroyed or fleeing. Darius's secret weapon had accomplished nothing. Then the Persian cavalry charged, masses of horsemen attempting to overlap Alexander's flanks and surround his army. This was the crisis moment. If the Persian cavalry succeeded in getting behind the Phalanx, they could attack its vulnerable rear, and the entire formation would collapse. Alexander had planned for this. He had positioned his Phalanx at an angle, refusing his left flank while his right extended forward. As the Persian cavalry charged, the Phalanx wheeled, pivoting on its left corner, creating a rotating wall of sarissas that prevented the Persians from getting around its flanks. Meanwhile, Alexander led his Companion Cavalry in a charge directly at the Persian centre, aiming for Darius himself. The Persian king, seeing Alexander's distinctive helmet and the royal squadron cutting through his guard, fled. Again. For the second time in 2 battles, Darius abandoned his army at the moment of crisis. This time, the psychological impact was catastrophic. The Persian infantry, seeing their king flee while they were still fighting, lost all morale. The Phalanx, which had been slowly grinding forward against fierce resistance, suddenly faced an enemy that had stopped believing in victory. The organised Persian defence disintegrated into individual soldiers trying to escape. The Battle of Gaugamela became the pursuit of Gaugamela, Macedonian cavalry chasing fleeing Persians for 20 miles, killing them by the tens of thousands. Ancient sources claim 40,000 to 90,000 Persians died at Gaugamela. The Macedonians lost fewer than 1,000 men. The Persian Empire, which had ruled the known world for 200 years, effectively ended that afternoon. Darius would flee east, be betrayed by his own men, and die ignominiously, stabbed by his generals. Alexander would enter Babylon in triumph, be crowned king of Asia, and within 2 years control territory from Greece to India. But the true victory wasn't territorial. It was conceptual. Alexander and his Phalanx had proven that systematic organisation and training could defeat any amount of individual courage, any numerical superiority, any tactical genius. The old way of warfare, brave men fighting in loose formations relying on personal skill, was obsolete. The future belonged to whoever could create the most efficient military system, whoever could train soldiers to function as components in a machine, whoever could remove human weakness through mechanical perfection. This realization spread throughout the ancient world. After Gaugamela, no major power tried to fight Alexander in open battle. They understood it was suicide. Cities opened their gates, satraps surrendered their provinces, entire regions submitted without resistance. The few who did resist, like the Indian King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes, fought with courage and skill and lost anyway. Porus deployed 200 war elephants, animals that terrified horses and could break infantry formations. The Phalanx treated them like the scythed chariots, opening lanes, letting them through, then closing ranks and continuing forward. The elephants, wounded by javelins and arrows, panicked and rampaged through their own lines. Porus's army of 50,000 broke against the Phalanx and Alexander's cavalry. Porus himself fought on, wounded and defiant until his elephant collapsed and he was captured. Alexander admired his courage so much that he restored Porus to his throne as a client king. Courage was admirable, but it couldn't defeat the system. The Phalanx's dominance continued even after Alexander's death in 323 BC. His generals, the Diadochi, carved his empire into successor kingdoms and fought each other for decades, but they all used the Phalanx as the core of their armies. At the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, 75,000 Macedonian-style infantry and multiple phalanxes fought each other with the same tactics Alexander had perfected. At Raphia in 217 BC, the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires deployed 130,000 men between them, nearly all in phalanx formations. The system had become so dominant that major battles consisted of phalanx against phalanx, decided by which side had better cavalry support or broke formation first. For 150 years, no one found a reliable counter to the Macedonian phalanx. The formation dominated the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, making traditional warfare obsolete. Armies that didn't adopt phalanx tactics were slaughtered. Those that did adopt them fought to stalemates, or won through non-phalanx elements like cavalry and light infantry. The core heavy infantry battle was usually decided by which phalanx was deeper, better trained, or fighting on more favourable terrain. Then, Rome found the answer, not through a single brilliant innovation, but through systematic adaptation over decades of defeats. The Romans had faced Macedonian-style phalanxes during the Pyrrhic War of 280 to 275 BC, when King Pyrrhus of Epirus invaded Italy with 25,000 troops, including phalanx infantry and war elephants. Pyrrhus won every major battle, Heraclea, Asculum, Beneventum, crushing Roman armies that used traditional Mediterranean tactics. But he lost so many men in his victories that he eventually withdrew. His campaign gave history the phrase Pyrrhic victory, a win so costly it's effectively a defeat. More importantly, it taught Rome that the phalanx was beatable, not through superior fighting, but through superior endurance. The Romans couldn't match the phalanx's battlefield dominance, but they could outlast it through superior logistics, recruitment, and willingness to accept casualties. Over the next century, Rome developed the manipular legion, a formation based on flexibility rather than power. Where the phalanx was a single massive block moving in unison, the legion was divided into maniples, small units of 120 men that could move independently. This allowed the legion to maintain formation on rough terrain where the phalanx struggled. More importantly, it created redundancy. If a maniple was destroyed, the legion continued fighting. If a section of the phalanx broke, the entire formation collapsed. The showdown came in 197 BC at Cynoscephali in Thessaly. Philip Thantf of Macedon, direct descendant of Alexander's line, commanded 25,000 men, including 16,000 phalanx infantry. Titus Quinctius Flamininus led a Roman army of similar size. The battle began in fog on rolling hills, exactly the terrain where the phalanx was least effective. Philip deployed his phalanx anyway, believing in the formation's invincibility. The right half of his phalanx advanced downhill into the Roman left, and for a moment the old dominance reasserted itself. The sarissas struck home, the Romans gave ground, the formation marched forward in perfect order. But Philip's left wing, delayed by the terrain, arrived late and out of formation. A Roman tribune, name unknown, took 20 maniples, approximately 2,400 men, and hit the disordered Macedonian left from behind. The Phalanx, attacked from the rear, couldn't turn. The sarissa required both hands and perfect balance. You couldn't reverse your stance quickly. You couldn't defend yourself individually. The entire formation had to turn together, which required space and time. The Romans gave them neither. They cut into the Phalanx rear with short swords, gladly designed for close combat. The Macedonians dropped their unwieldy pikes and tried to fight with sidearms. They were slaughtered. In 20 minutes, 8,000 Phalanx soldiers died, trapped in a formation that had become a killing box. The survivors fled, and with them fled the myth of Phalanx invincibility. The final demonstration came at Pydna in 168 BC. Perseus of Macedon fielded the last great Phalanx army, 40,000 men including 20,000 in the Phalanx formation. The Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus opposed him with 25,000 legionaries. Perseus advanced his Phalanx on level ground, textbook terrain for the formation. The Romans gave ground, orderly retreat under the pressure of the sarissa forest. Ancient observers, watching from nearby hills, believed they were witnessing a Macedonian victory. The Phalanx was unstoppable in its element. But Aemilius had learned from cynocephaly. He didn't try to break the Phalanx frontally. He simply continued retreating toward rougher ground. The Phalanx maintaining formation followed. As the terrain became uneven, small gaps appeared in the Macedonian line. Individual soldiers struggled to maintain spacing while climbing over rocks and through gullies. The formation's perfect alignment, its essential strength, began to fracture. The Romans attacked these gaps with their maniples, small units exploiting small weaknesses. Once they penetrated the formation, the Phalanx collapsed. The Macedonians couldn't fight effectively at close range with their long pikes. They died in their thousands, trapped in a formation designed for open battle. Perseus fled. The Macedonian kingdom was abolished. The era of the Phalanx ended, but its legacy continued. Every modern military formation traces lineage to the same insight that created Alexander's Phalanx. Systematic training and standardized tactics defeat individual prowess. The Roman legion that defeated the Phalanx operated on the same principle. Soldiers drilled to execute maneuvers automatically. Formations maintained through training rather than courage. The pike squares of medieval Swiss mercenaries were essentially phalanxes adapted for new weapons. The linear formations of 18th century warfare, soldiers standing in lines firing muskets in unison, were the phalanx reborn with gunpowder. The combined arms doctrine of modern militaries, different units supporting each other's weaknesses, was Alexander's innovation. The tank formations of World War II, overwhelming force concentrated at the enemy's weak point, were the Companion Cavalry writ large. The Macedonian Phalanx succeeded not because it was unbeatable, but because it forced everyone else to evolve. Before Alexander, warfare was art, generals winning through inspired tactics, warriors prevailing through individual skill, battles decided by courage and chaos. After Alexander, warfare was science, victory coming from better systems rather than better men, battles decided by logistics and training long before the first blow was struck. The Phalanx made conquest routine, reducing it from an epic undertaking to an administrative process. When Alexander entered Babylon and the gates opened without resistance, when city after city surrendered without fighting, when satraps yielded their provinces on word of his approach, it wasn't because Alexander was uniquely terrible or cruel. It was because the Phalanx had mathematically solved warfare, creating a system so efficient that resistance had become objectively irrational. This was Alexander's true legacy, not the empire he built, which fragmented within a generation, but the proof that organized systems defeat brave individuals every time, that training beats talent, that the army that can maintain formation under pressure will always defeat the army that relies on warrior spirit. The Phalanx made conquest mechanical, transforming it from a test of civilizations to a simple question of who had the better system. And once warfare became systematic rather than heroic, the romantic age of warfare died. In its place came the modern age of military science, of logistics and training, of soldiers as components in machines. Alexander didn't just conquer the known world, he conquered the very concept of conquest, reducing it to mathematics and mechanics. The Phalanx was the equation that solved for victory every time, and everyone who faced it died learning the answer. The Romans understood what they had defeated at Pydna, and more importantly, they understood what they had learned. The Manipular legion that destroyed the Phalanx wasn't superior because it was Roman. It was superior because it had evolved to counter a specific system by becoming a better system. This created a new arms race, not of weapons or warriors, but of organizational theory. The question was no longer who has the bravest soldiers, but who has the most adaptable military structure. And this question, first posed by the clash between Phalanx and legion, would drive military evolution for the next 2,000 years. But before Rome's triumph relegated the Phalanx to history, there was a period of approximately 150 years when Alexander's system achieved something unprecedented in military history. It created a universal standard for Mediterranean and Near Eastern warfare. Every major power, from the Seleucid Empire in Syria to the Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt, from the Greek leagues to the successor kingdoms of Asia Minor, organized their armies around phalanx corps formations. This wasn't imitation, it was necessity. An army without a phalanx facing an army with one was committing suicide. The formation had become so dominant that military innovation focused not on replacing it, but on optimizing the supporting elements. How many light infantry should screen the flanks? What ratio of cavalry to phalanx infantry produced optimal results? Should the phalanx be 16 ranks deep or 32? These were the questions that occupied military theorists in the Hellenistic age. The mathematical perfection of the phalanx was analysed extensively by ancient military writers. Asclepiodotus, writing around 100 BC, provided detailed specifications in his tactics treatise. The basic unit, the syntagma, consisted of 256 men arranged in a 16 by 16 square. Each man required 3 feet of width in normal order, allowing room to wield the sarissa. In close order, for combat, this compressed to 18 inches per man. In locked shields formation, for receiving cavalry charges, men stood literally shoulder to shoulder. The mathematics created specific force densities. A syntagma in close order occupied 1,536 square feet, concentrating 256 men into an area smaller than many modern apartments. The weight of this concentration, approximately 10,000 pounds of men and equipment, created pressure measured in pounds per square foot that exceeded the structural strength of most opposing formations. The sarissa itself was an engineering marvel that historians underappreciated until modern reconstructions revealed its sophistication. The weapon wasn't a single piece of wood. It was constructed from 2 sections of cornel wood, a dense hardwood from the Cornelian cherry tree, joined by a bronze collar at the midpoint. This design solved multiple problems simultaneously. A single 18-foot shaft would have been impossibly heavy and prone to warping. The 2-piece design distributed weight efficiently and allowed replacement of damaged sections without discarding the entire weapon. The bronze collar added rigidity at the weapon's balance point while providing a gripping surface. The forward section, approximately 10 feet long, tapered from 2 inches in diameter at the collar to 1 inch at the tip. The rear section, 8 feet long, remained consistently 2 inches in diameter for balance. Total weight was approximately 14 pounds, which seems manageable until you consider holding it extended at a 45-degree angle for hours during battle marches. The bronze spear point, the actual killing surface, measured 18 inches long and was leaf-shaped, designed to penetrate armour and flesh with minimal resistance. But the sophisticated element was the counterweight, a bronze butt spike at the rear that weighed nearly 2 pounds. This wasn't decorative. The counterweight moved the sarissa's balance point forward to approximately the hand grip position, allowing a soldier to extend the massive weapon without supporting its full weight at arm's length. The physics created a lever system where the rear section balanced the forward section, making the unwieldy pike marginally wieldy. Even with perfect balance, holding a sarissa in combat position for extended periods caused arm trembling and fatigue that could break formation. This is why the rear ranks held their weapons vertically, providing a rotation system where front ranks could be relieved before exhaustion degraded their effectiveness. Training a phalanx soldier to wield this weapon required months of specific conditioning. New recruits spent weeks simply learning to hold the sarissa at the proper angle without wavering. They practiced the pike drill, lowering and raising the weapon in unison with their unit, until the motion became automatic. They learned the 3 positions, vertical for march and rest, 45-degree angle for advance, and horizontal for close combat. They practiced maintaining their position while the man next to them fell, filling gaps instantly without breaking stride. They drilled in formation, marching until they could maintain perfect spacing while advancing across broken ground at various speeds. The training was monotonous, physically exhausting, and psychologically grinding. But it produced soldiers who could execute complex maneuvers under combat stress without conscious thought, which was exactly the point. The psychological effect of facing a phalanx in full advance was documented by numerous ancient sources, and modern military psychologists have analysed these accounts to understand the formation's mental impact. Polybius, the Greek historian who witnessed phalanx warfare firsthand before writing his histories in the 2nd century BC, described the sight of an advancing phalanx as one of the most terrifying experiences in ancient warfare. The forest of bronze pike points, all aligned at precisely the same angle, all advancing at exactly the same pace, created an impression of inhuman coordination that shattered enemy morale before contact. The sound amplified this psychological assault. 16,000 men marching in perfect unison created a rhythmic thunder of bronze-shod boots striking earth. The officers' commands, shouted in Macedonian Greek, echoed across the battlefield. The sarissas themselves produced an eerie whistling sound as thousands of pikes cut through air simultaneously. But the most psychologically devastating element was the inevitability. Unlike cavalry charges, which could be evaded, or archer barrages, which could be endured behind shields, the phalanx advance offered no hope of escape. It moved slowly, approximately 2 miles per hour in combat formation, giving defenders long minutes to contemplate their approaching death. You could see the individual faces of the men who would kill you. You could count the pike points aimed at your position. You could calculate with horrible precision exactly when the sarissas would reach your flesh. This anticipatory terror broke armies before contact. Numerous ancient accounts describe formations simply disintegrating, men fleeing or surrendering rather than face the phalanx impact. Those who stood their ground displayed courage that bordered on the suicidal, because standing against a phalanx meant mathematical certainty of being impaled. The actual experience of combat within the phalanx was documented through various sources, including the soldier accounts recorded by historians who interviewed veterans. The front-rank men described combat as surreal and detached. You couldn't see much beyond the row of sarissas projecting ahead of you and the enemy formation approaching. Your vision was restricted by your helmet's cheek guards. Your hearing was muffled by the bronze. Your primary sensory input was the press of the man behind you, the weight of your armour, and the resistance transmitted through your pike when it struck flesh. You knew you had hit someone when your sarissa suddenly became heavier, the added weight of an impaled body pulling on the shaft. Training dictated the response. Withdraw the pike with a pulling motion while stepping forward, immediately extend again. The men behind you would trample the body you had killed. You would never see their face. The 2nd through 6th ranks described combat as even more abstract. You couldn't see the enemy at all, only your comrades' backs and the vertical forest of rear-rank sarissas. Your entire job was maintaining your pike at the precise angle drilled into you, adding your point to the killing zone ahead, and pushing forward with your body weight. You would hear the impacts, the screams, the sounds of men dying yards ahead of you. You would feel the formation's momentum shift as you advanced over bodies, but you would never see the enemy until the formation broke or the battle ended. This sensory deprivation created a dissociative state that helped soldiers endure the horror. You weren't killing people, you were executing a drill you had practiced 1,000 times. The blood on your sarissa when you finally lowered it was abstract, disconnected from the act of killing. The rear ranks, positions 7 through 16, experienced battle primarily as physical endurance. Your job was pushing the men ahead of you forward, adding your body weight to the formation's momentum. You held your sarissa vertically or carried it on your shoulder, ready to replace fallen front-rank fighters. The actual combat was invisible, happening 30 feet ahead beyond multiple ranks of armoured backs. What you experienced was claustrophobia, the press of men on all sides, the impossibility of retreat. If the front rank broke and men tried to flee, they would run into you, creating a compression that trapped everyone. This is why phalanx casualties were so low when the formation held and catastrophic when it broke. An intact phalanx was nearly invulnerable. A broken phalanx was a mob of men with unwieldy weapons trapped in close quarters, helpless against enemies who could get inside pike range. The logistics of maintaining a phalanx army revealed another dimension of Alexander's systematic genius. A phalanx soldier required approximately 40 pounds of equipment: bronze cuirass, greaves, helmet, pelter shield, sarissa, short sword, and personal items. This equipment needed constant maintenance. Bronze armour corroded and required polishing. The linen cuirass, layers of glued linen that provided surprising protection against slashing weapons, needed repair after battle. The sarissa's wooden sections warped in humidity and cracked from stress, requiring replacement. Each phalanx soldier needed support personnel, craftsmen who could maintain equipment, servants who handled baggage, and supply trains that provided food and replacement gear. Alexander's army included specialized units for this support. Each syntagma had attached craftsmen, carpenters, who could repair sarissas, bronze smiths who could fix armor, leather workers who handled straps and fittings. The army traveled with herds of livestock for food, but more importantly for materials. Cattle hides became leather for shield backing and straps, sheep. Wool was processed into felt for helmet linings. Bones were rendered into glue for the linen cuirasses. Nothing was wasted because waste degraded combat effectiveness. An army that couldn't maintain its equipment would see its phalanx effectiveness degrade as sarissas broke, armour failed, and soldiers fought with substandard gear. The financial cost of fielding a phalanx was substantial, which limited who could deploy the formation effectively. Each phalanx soldier's equipment represented approximately 6 months of skilled labour wages in the ancient economy. A syntagma of 256 men required equipment worth roughly 130 years of labour. A full phalanx of 16,384 men, the standard for Alexander's major battles, required equipment equivalent to 8,400 years of skilled labour. This doesn't include training costs, support personnel, food, or logistics. Only wealthy states could afford proper phalanx armies, which partially explains why the formation dominated Hellenistic warfare. The successor kingdoms that inherited Alexander's empire had accumulated enough wealth to field multiple phalanxes, while smaller states and tribal groups couldn't afford even one properly equipped unit. But Alexander's true innovation in phalanx logistics was systematic recruitment and training infrastructure. Philip II had created this system, and Alexander perfected it. Macedonia established permanent training camps where recruits spent 6 months learning phalanx warfare before joining combat units. This ensured consistent quality and standardized tactics across the entire army. When a soldier fell in battle, his replacement didn't need to learn a new system or integrate into an unfamiliar organization. He stepped into a position he had trained for specifically, performing a role he had practiced hundreds of times. This systematic approach to human resources was centuries ahead of its time. Most ancient armies relied on militia soldiers who trained intermittently and learned tactics from veterans through oral tradition. The Macedonian system treated soldier training as an industrial process, with standardized outputs and quality control. The evolution of phalanx tactics under Alexander demonstrated how a fixed system could adapt through application rather than modification. The core formation never changed, but how Alexander deployed it varied dramatically based on terrain, enemy, and strategic objectives. At Granicus, he used the phalanx as a fixing force while cavalry delivered the decisive blow. At Issus, the phalanx was the primary killing instrument, grinding through enemy infantry while cavalry protected flanks. At Gaugamela, the phalanx fought a defensive battle, holding position against overwhelming numbers while Alexander's cavalry hunted the Persian king. At Hydaspes, against Indian war elephants, the phalanx dispersed into gaps, allowing the elephants through, then reformed to attack the enemy infantry. The formation's adaptability within its constraints demonstrated sophisticated tactical thinking. These tactical variations were possible because of the officers commanding the phalanx units. The syntagma commander, called a syntagmatarch, was typically a veteran with 10 or more years of experience. He didn't fight in formation but stood behind his unit observing the battle and issuing commands. The phalanx could execute approximately a dozen standard maneuvers, turns, formation changes, advances and halts without breaking cohesion. The syntagmatarch would call these maneuvers using voice commands and a bronze whistle. The soldiers, through training, would execute them automatically. This command and control system allowed the seemingly rigid phalanx to respond to battlefield developments faster than more flexible formations that relied on individual soldier initiative. The phalanx's dominance created a strategic calculus that shaped Hellenistic geopolitics. States knew that open battle against an equal or superior phalanx was mutually destructive. Both sides would suffer catastrophic casualties, even if one side technically won. This encouraged alternative strategies. Siege warfare became prevalent as cities fortified themselves against phalanx armies. Economic warfare, disrupting enemy supply lines, became more important than battlefield victory. Coalition building, combining multiple smaller phalanxes to outnumber a larger opponent, drove diplomatic efforts. The phalanx was so effective that it made conventional warfare economically unsustainable, pushing conflicts into other domains. This was conquest redefined, not through better fighting, but through making fighting so costly that alternatives became preferable. The social impact of the phalanx system transformed Macedonian and later Hellenistic society in ways historians are still analysing. The formation required every soldier to be identically equipped and trained, which created pressure towards social equality within military units. A noble's son stood in the same rank as a farmer's son, wore the same armour, carried the same pike, and faced the same dangers. This military egalitarianism didn't extend to society generally, but it created bonds of shared experience that cut across class lines. Veterans of phalanx warfare formed a distinct social class, men who had stood in the Bronze Wall and survived. They had shared experiences that civilians couldn't comprehend. This created a separate military culture with its own values, hierarchies, and identity. Alexander exploited this military culture brilliantly. He frequently fought in the front ranks of his Companion Cavalry, sharing the dangers he ordered his men to face. He visited wounded soldiers personally, asking about their injuries, praising their courage. He knew many soldiers by name and could recall their accomplishments in previous battles. This personal connection between commander and troops created loyalty that transcended normal military discipline. Men didn't fight for Macedonia or for abstract glory. They fought for Alexander, the man who stood with them, who bled with them, who remembered their names. This cult of personality, combined with the phalanx's systematic effectiveness, created an army that was simultaneously a precision instrument and a personal warband. The phalanx's requirement for flat, open terrain shaped Alexander's strategic choices in ways that aren't always obvious. He avoided mountain warfare where possible, delegating such campaigns to light infantry specialists. He chose battle sites carefully, often marching for days to find terrain suitable for phalanx deployment. When forced to fight on unfavourable ground, like the river crossing at Granicus or the hills at Gaugamela, he modified his tactics to minimise the phalanx's terrain handicap. This strategic terrain consciousness influenced his entire campaign route through Asia. He followed river valleys and coastal plains where his phalanx could deploy effectively. He avoided the mountainous interior of Asia Minor, instead conquering the accessible coastal regions first. His route to India followed relatively flat terrain through Mesopotamia and Persia, then up the Indus Valley. This wasn't cowardice or convenience, it was systematic exploitation of his army's strengths. The few occasions when Alexander fought in terrain unsuitable for the phalanx revealed both the formation's limitations and his tactical creativity. The siege of the Sogdian Rock in 327 BC exemplified this. The fortress sat atop a sheer cliff considered impregnable. The phalanx was useless in such terrain. Alexander recruited 300 soldiers with mountain climbing experience, offered them massive rewards for reaching the summit, and had them scale the cliff at night using iron tent pegs and ropes. At dawn, the defenders saw Macedonian soldiers above them on supposedly unclimbable rock and surrendered, believing Alexander could work miracles. The fortress fell without the phalanx fighting a single engagement. This wasn't phalanx warfare. This was psychological warfare enabled by Alexander's understanding that the phalanx's reputation could win battles it couldn't fight. The legendary Gordian knot incident illustrated Alexander's approach to problems the phalanx couldn't solve. The ancient prophecy claimed whoever untied the impossibly complex knot would rule Asia. Alexander, according to legend, simply cut it with his sword, declaring the method of untying didn't matter, only the result. This story, whether literal truth or propaganda, encapsulates the phalanx philosophy. Don't solve problems through clever technique. Apply overwhelming force directly to the objective. The phalanx didn't outmaneuver enemies. It attacked them frontally and destroyed them through superior system design. Subtlety was for armies that lacked the capability for direct assault. As Alexander's conquests extended east, he incorporated foreign troops into his army, and these integration efforts revealed the Phalanx's cultural limitations. Persian, Bactrian, and Indian soldiers could be trained in phalanx tactics, but they lacked the cultural foundation that made Macedonian phalanx soldiers effective. The Macedonians had grown up in a militaristic society that valued discipline and collective effort. They instinctively understood formation fighting because Macedonian culture emphasized group cohesion. Foreign troops, from cultures that valued individual warrior prowess, struggled with the phalanx submersion of individual identity into collective action. They could learn the mechanics, but not the mentality. This created a two-tier system: Macedonian phalanxes for critical battles, foreign auxiliaries for secondary operations. The decline of Alexander's army's effectiveness in his final years demonstrated the phalanx's dependence on experienced personnel. By 325 BC, after 8 years of continuous campaigning, the original Macedonian veterans were depleted through casualties, discharge, and garrison duty. Replacements from Macedonia couldn't match the training and experience of the men they replaced. The army that fought in India was numerically larger than the force that invaded Persia, but qualitatively inferior. At Hydaspes, Alexander's army barely defeated Porus despite significant numerical superiority. This wasn't because Indian tactics countered the phalanx, but because the phalanx itself was degraded. The soldiers were younger, less experienced, more prone to formation errors. The systematic perfection was eroding. Alexander's death in 323 BC at age 32 triggered a succession crisis that would test whether the phalanx system could outlive its creator. The Wars of the Diadochi, Alexander's generals fighting for pieces of his empire, became a laboratory for phalanx warfare. Armies consisting almost entirely of phalanx infantry and supporting cavalry fought dozens of major battles between 322 and 275 BC. These conflicts revealed that the phalanx was indeed systematically superior, but when both sides used identical systems, other factors determined victory. Generalship mattered more than the formation. Logistics determined which army could maintain its phalanx longer. Morale and training quality differentiated otherwise identical forces. The phalanx had solved the tactical problem so completely that strategy and operations became the decisive level of warfare. The Battle of Paratacene in 317 BC between Antigonus and Eumenes exemplified this evolution. Both armies fielded nearly identical phalanxes, approximately 35,000 heavy infantry each. The battle lasted an entire day, with phalanxes grinding against each other in the centre, while cavalry forces tried to break the enemy flanks. Casualties were catastrophic on both sides, nearly 10,000 dead combined, but neither phalanx broke. The battle ended in tactical draw because the system had become so robust that it couldn't defeat itself. Victory went to whichever commander could exploit non-phalanx elements more effectively. This battle prefigured the future of warfare. Once everyone adopted the optimal tactical system, competition moved to higher organizational levels. The gradual eastward spread of the phalanx created hybrid systems that revealed the formation's adaptability. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in what is now Afghanistan developed phalanxes that incorporated Central Asian horse archer tactics. Indian kingdoms adopted the phalanx while retaining war elephants, creating combined arms forces unknown in the Mediterranean. These hybrid developments showed that the phalanx wasn't a complete military system, but an optimal solution to a specific problem: heavy infantry combat on open terrain. It could be integrated into different military cultures, but it worked best within the Macedonian system that had developed specifically around its strengths and weaknesses. The eventual Roman victory over the phalanx shouldn't obscure how long the formation dominated. From Philip II's reforms in 358 BC to Pydna in 168 BC represents 190 years of phalanx supremacy. For comparison, Napoleon's military system dominated for roughly 20 years, German blitzkrieg tactics for 6 years, American carrier warfare for perhaps 40 years before anti-ship missiles and submarines made it problematic. The phalanx's 2 centuries of dominance was extraordinary. It persisted because it worked, and it worked because it was systematic rather than brilliant. Brilliant tactics can be countered by equally brilliant opposition. Systems can only be defeated by better systems, and developing better systems takes time. The phalanx's ultimate legacy was proving that warfare could be solved, at least temporarily, through systematic analysis and optimization. Before Philip and Alexander, war was art. After them, it was also science. This transformation spread beyond military thinking into other domains. The Hellenistic period saw systematic approaches applied to mathematics, engineering, medicine, and philosophy. The idea that complex problems could be solved through systematic methods rather than individual genius became foundational to Western thought. The Phalanx was one of the earliest and most successful applications of this principle. It didn't require superhuman soldiers or brilliant generals, though both helped. It required systematic training, standardized equipment, and disciplined execution. It proved that the right system, properly implemented, could dominate regardless of who opposed it. Modern military organizations directly descend from Macedonian innovations. The concept of universal military training, where citizens serve in standardized units using identical equipment and tactics, traces to Philip's reforms. The idea of combined arms warfare, different troop types supporting each other, was perfected by Alexander. The principle that logistics and training matter more than individual courage comes from phalanx warfare. Even modern military terminology retains echoes. Phrases like close ranks and holding the line originate from phalanx tactics. The systematic approach to warfare, treating it as a problem to be solved through optimal resource allocation rather than a test of manly virtue, is Alexander's intellectual legacy. The phalanx ultimately fell not because it was defeated in fair combat, but because warfare evolved past it. The Roman legion succeeded by fighting on terrain where the phalanx couldn't deploy effectively, then using tactical flexibility to exploit the formation's rigidity. But this required Rome to develop a system as sophisticated as the phalanx itself, just optimized for different conditions. The legion wasn't simpler or more intuitive than the phalanx. It was differently complex, trading concentrated shock power for adaptability. This evolution validated the phalanx's underlying principle. The best military force isn't the bravest or most skilled, it's the most systematically optimized for the conditions it faces. Rome defeated the phalanx by creating a system even more sophisticated, not by rejecting systematization. In the final analysis, Alexander's phalanx redefined conquest by industrializing it. Before the phalanx, conquest required unique circumstances, exceptional leadership, temporary advantages, or cultural factors. Alexander demonstrated that conquest could be routine, reproducible, and systematic. You didn't need legendary warriors. You needed standardized training. You didn't need tactical genius. You needed systematic planning. You didn't need perfect conditions. You needed a system robust enough to work in imperfect conditions. The phalanx was that system. It transformed conquest from historical exception to administrative procedure. Cities surrendered because resistance was mathematically futile. Empires crumbled because opposing the phalanx system with traditional military organization was suicide. Alexander conquered the known world not through unprecedented courage or tactical brilliance, though he possessed both. He conquered it through systematic optimization of human violence. The phalanx was a machine for turning men into territory, operating with industrial efficiency centuries before industrialization. That was its true innovation. That was how it redefined conquest itself.